All right, welcome to this new module for molecular ecology. And in this module, we are focusing on how to use molecular techniques to identify species. And to start, I want to illustrate why this topic is so important and useful with an example. So, assuming you eat fish, and my apologies if you don't, just try to play along and humor me. But what I want you to think about is, assuming you do eat fish, how do you know you're eating the fish you think you're eating? So what I'm showing here are two different pieces of fish that you might find in a market if you were buying fish to eat it. And if you were just looking at this, are you able to tell what species it is? And can you tell if those are the same species or different species? I personally cannot, but the reason why this is a good example of when we need to use molecular techniques to identify species are something like this, where you have a fish fillet where it doesn't have any morphological characteristics. So normally if you were looking at two different types of adult fish, whole intact fish, you might be able to tell what species it was. But when you get down to something like this, where it's a subsample of an organism, it's harder to tell what species it is. And the reason why this topic in particular is important is because they've done studies and they've actually found that about 25% of seafood is fraudulently ID'd, meaning what it says it is at the market, about 25% of the time is incorrect. And sometimes the ID is wrong on purpose, so they've found some instances where restaurants or markets try to sell you something and say it's tuna, but it's really something that should be cheaper, like tilapia. Or in this instance that I'm using here, there have been instances of people substituting an endangered species and saying it's something else. So in this image here, the fillet on the top is from a swordfish, and the fillet on the bottom is from an endangered mako shark. And this is one example where they have found that restaurants or markets were selling mako shark but telling people it was swordfish. Because if you're an educated consumer, we know that it's probably not good to eat endangered species like mako sharks, right? But the markets are telling us it's something else, and if we don't know any better, we believe them, right? So that's one example of how we can use these molecular identification techniques to apply in the real world and answer some really important questions. So for this module, some of the main learning objectives or things you're going to be able to do by the time you complete this module are compare and contrast different types of approaches for using molecular techniques to identify species. We're going to talk about a couple different types of approaches, and one of the things you'll do throughout the quizzes is select which of those approaches, either barcoding, metabarcoding, or metagenomics, would be best to address a given scientific question. So you'll start to get some practice in figuring out, based on a scenario, what type of approach would be best. And then lastly, what you'll be able to do is choose a scientific paper that could be used to write a proposal about this topic of molecular species identification. And just like in many of the previous modules, you'll have mini quizzes that are associated with each mini lecture video that I give you. And then at the end of the module, there's one main assignment that is going to ask you to find a paper related to molecular ID of species. This is one example of a paper that I found. The search terms I used were metagenomics, molecular ecology. So when you get to this point, you could substitute. So metagenomics is one technique we used. You could also search for metabarcoding molecular ecology. But those are some search terms you can use when you're looking for papers related to the topics we'll talk about in this module. Another tip, this particular journal, Molecular Ecology Resources, or just the journal Molecular Ecology, those are two really good journals that have a lot of papers related to, unsurprisingly, the topic that we're talking about, molecular ecology. This is one particular paper I found talking about the microbial diversity in the global ocean. So they use metagenomics to figure out how many different types of microbial species are there. And that's often one of the applications of these molecular species identification techniques. That's one of the things you're trying to figure out is overall how many different species are there and overall what the biodiversity looks like. And the reason why this module is important for preparing you for the end goal of our course, which is writing that NSF GRFP proposal, is that, of course, in order to write a proposal, you have to understand the topic that you're writing about, right? So we'll start with molecular species ID in this module. And just to remind or explain, we have this one main proposal at the very end of the semester. In order to build up to that, what we're going to do is we're going to write several practice proposals before we get there. That's not how you spell proposal. And so for this first practice proposal, for instance, what I'm going to ask you to do is pick one of the topics we've discussed so far in our course and write a practice mini proposal based on one of the topics we've covered so far. So for the first proposal you write, this species molecular ID is one potential topic. So what I'm going to do is ask you to find a paper related to that topic, so you then have a starting point when you actually start writing your first proposal one, so you have something to refer to help you write that proposal. Everything I'm trying to do in this course is to help you build towards that end goal in little steps, so that's why this module is important and why that particular assignment is important.